recognize our good friend from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm perplexed a little bit because I think the title of this hearing is about kitchen table issues and economics, and all I've heard really is kind of like the typical Project 2025 boogeyman that keeps coming out. I got to hand it to him. I think North Korea would be proud of the level of propaganda on the other side. But we're here to talk about kitchen table issues, so let's talk about that. So the Census Bureau in Kamala Harris's home state of California, it's the #1 state of people moving out in 2024. They have a net migration of negative 10,453. Meanwhile, in my home state of South Carolina, we're #2 in actual growth, and we welcome them. It's a good environment, it's good weather, good beaches. Mr. DeVore, do you believe it's a result of the high cost of living and regulatory burdens inflicted on Californians by the progressive state government there that people are leaving? Is that the main culprit?
Yes. If you look at history with California, you go back to, let's say, 1960, the cost of living relative to the rest of the country was about 105 to 110%. So, roughly 5 to 10% higher as an index if the rest of the country averages out to 100. Today, it's between 145 to 150, meaning it's about 45% more costly to live in California than in the average of the U.S. A huge part of that is a regulatory burden. I mentioned, for example, the cost of electricity. When I was in the legislature, we went from 8th most expensive in the country, and now California is #2, only behind Hawaii, which derives its electricity from diesel generators and a little bit of solar. And that's pretty fantastic when you think about it. This huge state with all these abundant natural resources now has the second most costly electricity prices in the nation, and that's pretty important when you look at the push to electrify our economy, not just the transportation sector, but everything.
How will it affect the cost of living for Americans on a national level if we take the California model and apply it to Washington?
It's pretty staggering. So if you look at the study that was commissioned when I was in the legislature, looking at, for example, the compliance costs for small business in California, just for the California regulatory burden, in inflation-adjusted terms today, it came out to about $200,000 per small business. That was several times, by the way, what the federal regulatory burden was at the time. Now, the Biden-Harris administration put in regulatory policies just in the last 3.5 years that more than equaled the entire federal regulatory burden as it existed about 20 years ago. And so what's happening with these federal regulations is that by pushing California and New York-like regulations down on the rest of the country, what you're doing is you're erasing the interstate advantages of low-tax, low-regulatory states like your South Carolina. You're making South Carolina more like California and New York when that happens, sir.
Exactly. Thank you. I want to switch to energy independence for a second. What are some of the ways in which the next administration should differ, hopefully, than the current one as it pertains to energy independence? Are there policies that on day one should be re-examined or repealed so that we're actually an energy leader in the world?
That's a great question. Of course, you need to open up federal lands again for exploration and for energy extraction. I don't know if it can be undone, but certainly the Keystone XL pipeline was something that would have been fantastic for North America. Fascinating to me, though, that the administration okayed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline at the same time it shut down a pipeline to bring Canadian, reliable, affordable Canadian energy into America. So those two things right off the bat. The other thing I think would be to rescind a lot of these unhelpful subsidies that were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. What happens is that they're giving an incentive to unreliable, undispatchable power. And when you have power grids, as we've seen in California and as we've begun to see in Texas, that over-rely on wind and solar, what ends up happening is those power grids become unstable. You start to have planned blackouts or brownouts to manage your power supply. And lastly, you have to invest hugely in batteries to try to store the energy when it's being produced for when it's not available. The problem with battery energy, though, is it doesn't provide spinning reserve. Spinning reserve only can happen with large masses that allow for your electrical grid to be maintained at 60 hertz. Batteries can't do that. And so what happens is when your grid gets under strain because of a natural event like a snowstorm or a heat wave, or where it's not a windy day, your grid is going to be increasingly under threat to have rolling blackouts because batteries and wind and solar can't cut it. They don't have the reliability of thermal power like nuclear, coal, and natural gas.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.